The storm rolled over the dusty Montana valley like a beast waking from sleep, rattling the thin windows of the old McAllister ranch as 32-year-old rancher. Luke McAllister stood alone under the creaking barn light, staring at the strange mound of burlap he had dragged in from the edge of Miller Creek. People in Willow Ridge called Luke the Silent Rancher because he barely spoke unless necessary, keeping mostly to his cattle and his land since losing his parents in that snowstorm 12 years ago. But tonight even silence felt too loud as he pulled the wet cloth off the shape and revealed a young girl no older than 16, shivering, bruised and unconscious. Hours earlier he had found her barefoot, bleeding, and clutching a broken wooden box while whispering, "Please, don't do that," to someone who wasn't there, before collapsing right in front of his horse. Now the whole town was already asleep, unaware that Luke, who never involved himself in anyone's business, was about to make a decision that would shake the entire valley. He knew he should ride into town and call Sheriff Dalton, as any sensible rancher would, because nothing about this girl looked normal. Her wrists were rope-burned, her back carried old scars, and her clothes were torn as if she'd clawed her way out of something terrible. But when she awoke suddenly and grabbed his sleeve with surprising force, whispering, "Please, don't do that. Don't tell them where I am. They'll find me." Something in Luke's chest cracked open, an instinct, a warning, a promise he didn't yet understand. She begged him to hide her, to protect her for one night, and though every part of him screamed that this was trouble he didn't need, Luke McAllister, steady, logical, careful Luke, did something he never did. He followed his gut instead of his mind. He wrapped her in his only wool coat, set her by the fire in the barn, and told her she would be safe here. But before he could ask her anything more, a distant howl sliced through the storm, long, sharp, and much too human. The girl flinched violently. Luke stepped outside, scanning the darkness, seeing nothing but the heavy blanket of rain. He didn't know it yet, but 6 miles away, 3 armed men had already discovered the trail she left along Miller Creek, and they were coming. Willow Ridge would soon wake to a story, darker than anything they had ever whispered about in their little diners and feed stores. And as Luke stood guard over the barn, gripping his father's old rifle, he remembered the last thing the girl had said before she fainted again. 5 words that would soon echo across every porch in town. "Please, don't do that." He didn't know what she meant, but in the next 24 hours, the meaning would become deadly clear. The storm died at dawn, but the danger did not. Luke sat on the porch with his rifle across his lap as a strange silence settled over. Willow Ridge, the kind that made cattle restless and birds vanish from the fences. Inside the barn, the girl, who finally whispered her name as Elia, slept curled beneath a blanket, her breath shaky, her fists clenched as though gripping invisible nightmares. Luke had questions, thousands of them, but he forced himself to wait. He'd always been patient. But this time, patience felt like balancing a knife on its tip. When she finally woke, her voice was barely more than a thread as she revealed the truth. Her family wasn't dead like she thought. They had been taken by a group of men who roamed the backwoods under the name the Howlers, outlaws who trafficked people through the mountains, using abandoned mining tunnels where no sheriff dared to search. Elia had escaped 2 nights prior by injuring one of them and running blindly into the storm, but she knew they tracked her by scent, by prints, by anything left behind, and she begged Luke not to light the beacon. He didn't know what she meant until Sheriff Dalton arrived unannounced, hat dripping with rainwater, informing Luke that a report had come in about suspicious activity near the creek. Luke tried to lie, tried to keep Elia hidden, but the sheriff was an old friend of his father's and saw right through him. When Dalton stepped toward the barn, Elia grabbed Luke's arm and repeated the words that had haunted him all night. "Please, don't do that." But Dalton pushed past him, opened the barn door, and froze. Elia stared at him like a cornered animal. Dalton reached for his radio, and that was when the first explosion shook the ground. The Howlers had arrived. They didn't sneak. They announced themselves with violence, setting fire to the far cattle pasture, cutting through Luke's fences. and surrounding the ranch like wolves circling prey. Dalton shoved Luke behind a water trough as bullets ripped through the air. Elia screamed for Luke not to fight them, saying fighting would doom everyone. But Luke, who had lost too much, suffered too long, and buried too many regrets, did something reckless, something the whole town would later call the moment the silent rancher roared. He stood up, aimed at the gas lantern hanging by the fence, and shot it clean off. The lantern shattered, igniting a wall of fire that forced the howlers to retreat from the barn side, giving Dalton time to radio for backup. It was this exact action, the thing Elia begged him not to do, that saved them all. She had feared that lighting a fire would expose her location, but Luke, in one split-second choice, used that fire as a shield. As the sun rose, the sheriff's deputies, along with half the ranchers of Willow Ridge who had seen the smoke, arrived armed and furious. The howlers were captured, the tunnels raided, and Elia's family rescued by sundown. When the dust finally settled, the entire town stood outside Luke's ranch, silent, stunned, and staring at the man they thought barely had a voice. Elia walked up to him, tears streaking down her face, and whispered, "You did the one thing I begged you not to, and it saved my life." Luke only tipped his hat, because words still felt too small for the moment. The town never stopped talking about that day, about how the quietest man delivered the loudest justice, and how a single act, one dangerous, brave, impulsive act, changed the destiny of a terrified girl and exposed the darkest secret in their valley.